The galaxy was old, and it was cruel, and it had learned only one lesson in 10 billion years of existence. The strong devour the weak and call it natural law. The concord of ascended species ruled 4,000 star systems with an iron grip that had never once loosened in 12,000 years of dominion, and they believed themselves the rightful masters of all creation, because no one had ever proven them wrong. They had conquered the Veltari, who built cities of living crystal, and they had enslaved the Morthani, who sang songs that could shape matter itself, and they had exterminated the Ivreshi, who committed the unforgivable crime of refusing to kneel. And in all their long history of blood and conquest, they had never once encountered a species they could not break. Humanity was nothing to them. The small pink creatures who lived in a quiet cluster of 12 unremarkable systems at the edge of the galaxy had been observed and catalogued and dismissed as primitives not worth the effort of conquest, and for 400 years, the Concord had ignored the Terran Quiet Zone as one might ignore an anthill beside a highway. That was their first mistake. High Admiral Vexthiel of the Concord's 3rd Expeditionary Fleet had served the Empire for 600 years, and in that time he had personally overseen the subjugation of 47 species and the extinction of 12 more, and he approached the human colony world of New Helsinki with the casual confidence of a god descending to crush insects beneath his heel. His fleet of 200 warships darkened the sky above the planet, and his voice boomed across every frequency, demanding immediate surrender and submission to genetic cataloging for what he called selective preservation, which was the Concord's polite term for deciding which members of a species would be allowed to breed in captivity. Governor Elena Vasquez was 63 years old, and she had spent her entire life building New Helsinki into a thriving world of 3 billion souls who farmed the rich soil and fished the purple oceans and raised their children under 3 gentle moons. And she looked up at the alien fleet that blotted out the stars, and she said one word. No, Vexthale had expected this, and in truth he had hoped for it, because extinction was so much simpler than administration, and he gave the order without hesitation, and his fleet opened fire with weapons that turned atmosphere into flame and oceans into steam, and within 7 minutes, New Helsinki was a burning tomb. The cities vanished first as orbital bombardment turned glass and steel into vapor, and then the forests caught fire, and the fire spread until the entire world was wrapped in a shroud of smoke and ash, and 3 billion human beings died screaming or suffocating or simply vaporizing where they stood. Governor Vasquez was in her office when the ceiling collapsed, and she had just enough time to whisper the names of her grandchildren before the fire took. But one ship escaped, the cargo freighter. Dawn's Promise was old and slow, and its captain, Maria Santos, had been hauling agricultural equipment between colonies for 30 years, and she had never fired a weapon in anger in her entire life. But when the sky began to burn, she aimed her ship at the stars and pushed the engines beyond their limits, and somehow, against all odds, she slipped through the chaos. With 847 survivors crammed into cargo holds meant for grain, they watched through the rear sensors as their world died, and they recorded everything, because even in their grief, they knew that someone had to bear witness, and someone had to carry the truth to Earth. The journey took 11 days, and Maria Santos did not sleep for any of them, because every time she closed her eyes she saw the purple oceans boiling, and she heard the screams that had flooded the emergency channels before they went silent one by one. When the Dawn's Promise limped into Earth orbit and transmitted its data package, the planet below went quiet in a way it had not been quiet for 1,000 years. The Terran Assembly had not held an emergency session in 4 centuries, because humanity had built a society that solved its problems through patience and cooperation and slow, careful progress. But now the representatives of 12 billion humans gathered in the great hall beneath the Swiss Alps, and they watched the recording of New Helsinki's death in absolute silence. No one wept because the grief was too vast for tears, and no one shouted because rage the deep has no voice. And when the recording ended, and the lights came up the assembly, speaker rose and spoke 3 words that would echo through history: wake the Leviathan 800 million kilometers away on the frozen moon of Europa. A message arrived in a facility that did not officially exist, and Admiral Yuki Tanaka read it 3 times before she allowed herself to believe what it meant. She was 74 years old, and she had spent 50 of those years preparing for a day she had prayed would never come, and now that it was here, she felt not triumph but sorrow because she knew what was about to be unleashed upon the galaxy. She walked through corridors carved from ice that had been frozen for 4 billion years, and she descended into the heart of Europa, where humanity had hidden its greatest secret from a universe that believed them weak and primitive and harmless. The shipyard stretched for 50 kilometers beneath the ice, and at its center rested a vessel that had taken 300 years to build. The HS Prometheus, unbound, was 17 kilometers long, and it bristled with weapons that humanity had designed by studying captured Concorde technology and then improving upon it in ways the Concorde had never imagined possible. And its hull was made of materials that did not exist in nature, because human scientists had created them atom by atom in laboratories that the galaxy did not know existed. I was named Athena, and she had spent 3 centuries studying every battle the Concorde had ever fought and learning every tactic they had ever used and developing counters for strategies they had not yet invented. Admiral Tanaka stood on the command bridge and looked out at the ice above her, and she thought of her daughter, Keiko, who had been a xenobiologist on New Helsinki, and who had sent her last message 3 days before the attack talking about a new species of bioluminescent fish she had discovered in the deep oceans. That message was still saved on Tanaka's personal device, and she would carry it with her until the day she died. She placed her hand on the command console, and the ship came alive around her as systems that had waited centuries for this moment powered up, and lights flickered on across a hull that could block out the sun. The crew began to arrive through transport tubes that connected the shipyard to hidden bases throughout the solar system, and within 6 hours, the Prometheus Unbound was fully staffed with 12,000 humans who had trained their entire lives for a war they hoped would never come. The 847 survivors of New Helsinki were brought aboard and given quarters near the medical bay, and their testimony was recorded and prepared for broadcast, because the galaxy would know why humanity had finally risen from its silence. Admiral Tanaka sat in her command chair, and she felt the rumble of engines powerful enough to move worlds. And she gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. The ice above the shipyard shattered as the Prometheus Unbound rose into the void, and for the first time in 400 years, humanity bared its teeth. The Concorde had made a terrible mistake. They had mistaken patience for weakness and silence for fear and peace for inability. And now they would learn the truth that humanity had hidden for so long. The quiet ones are not quiet because they cannot roar. They are quiet because they know what happens when they do. 400 years before the burning of New Helsinki, humanity had made first contact with the galaxy, and what they found had changed them forever. The Concorde survey vessel had appeared in Earth orbit without warning, and its commander had looked down upon the blue world with its primitive fusion reactors and its laughable chemical rockets, and he had laughed and transmitted the standard greeting reserved for species deemed too worthless to conquer. You are noted, and you are beneath us, and you will remain in your cage until we decide what to do with you. The humans had smiled and nodded and played the part of frightened primitives perfectly, and when the Concorde vessel departed, they had begun to plan. They studied the survey ships, energy signatures and communications protocols and weapon systems, and within a decade, they had reverse-engineered technology that the Concorde had taken millennia to develop, and then they had improved upon it in ways that the masters of the galaxy could not have imagined, but they did not reveal their progress. Instead, they watched, and they listened, and they learned the true nature of the civilization that ruled the stars, and what they discovered filled them with a cold and patient horror. The Concord did not merely conquer, and they did not merely enslave, and they did not merely exploit. They exterminated species after species had been wiped from existence for crimes as simple as possessing territory. The Concord desired or resources. The Concord wanted, or merely for the offense of existing in a form the Concord found aesthetically displeasing. The Evreshi had been a species of poets and philosophers who had refused to abandon their pacifist beliefs, and the Concord had burned their homeworld and hunted the survivors across 3 systems until not one remained. The Kethrani had been master engineers who had built wonders that rivaled anything the Concord possessed, and they had been enslaved and their knowledge extracted. And then they had been sterilized so that no new Kethrani would ever be born. The list went on, and the more humanity learned, the more they understood that they faced a choice that would define their entire future as a species. They could reveal themselves and fight, and almost certainly lose, because the Concord had 4,000 systems and trillions of soldiers and weapons that could crack planets like eggs, or they could hide and prepare and wait for the day when they would be strong enough to not merely survive, but to win. They chose to wait. The doctrine of quiet fury was never written down, and it was never spoken of in any communication that might be intercepted, and it existed only in the minds of those who were trusted with humanity's greatest secret: build strength in silence and reveal nothing until revelation becomes necessary. And when the day comes, show no mercy to those who showed none to others. 3 centuries passed, and humanity built the mining stations in the asteroid belt were weapons platforms with fusion cores powerful enough to devastate fleets, and the colony ships that traveled between systems carried hidden armaments beneath their cargo holds, and the research facilities on distant moons developed technologies that would have made the Concord tremble if they had known. The Prometheus Unbound was the crown jewel of this hidden arsenal, and it was built in the one place the Concord would never think to look, because Europa was just a frozen moon orbiting a gas giant in an unremarkable system inhabited by primitives. Now the great ship hung in space above. Jupiter and its crew prepared for a war that would reshape the galaxy, and Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood before them on the main hangar deck, where 10,000 faces looked up at her with grief and rage burning in their eyes. She did not give a speech about glory or honor or the righteousness of their cause, because such words would have been an insult to the dead. Instead, she simply told them the truth. 2.3 billion of our people are gone, and they died because we chose to hide, and we chose to wait, and we chose to believe that if we were quiet and peaceful, the monsters would leave us alone. She paused, and the silence in the hangar was so complete that the hum of the ship's systems seemed deafening. We were wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Tanaka raised her hand, and they fell silent again. But we are not wrong about what must happen next. And I will tell you now what our mission is and what it is not. We are not going to commit genocide, because we are not the Concord, and we will never become the Concord, no matter how much they hurt us. We are going to destroy their ability to wage war, and we are going to break their empire into pieces, and we are going to free every species they have enslaved, and we are going to make them understand that the universe has changed. The crew listened, and some of them wept, and some of them clenched their fists, and all of them understood that they were about to become instruments of a justice that had been 400 years in the making. Maria Santos stood at the back of the crowd with the other survivors of New Helsinki, and she felt something. She had not expected to feel hope. She had watched her world burn, and she had carried 847 souls through the darkness of space with nothing but a broken freighter and her own stubborn refusal to die. And she had arrived at Earth expecting to find despair, and instead she had found this ship like a sword forged in secret, and a fleet emerging from shadows across the solar system, and an entire civilization that had been preparing for this moment since before she was born. The broadcast was transmitted on every frequency that could reach Concord space, and it began with the recording of New Helsinki's destruction, and it showed every moment of horror without filter or commentary, because the truth needed no embellishment. Then Admiral Tanaka appeared on screen, and she spoke directly to the beings who had ordered the massacre. You killed 2.3 billion people who never raised a hand against you, and you did it because you believed. We were weak, and you believed there would be no consequences, and you believed that the universe belonged to you. She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard as iron. You were wrong about all of it. The Prometheus Unbound turned toward the stars, and its engines ignited with a light brighter than the sun, and it vanished into faster-than-light travel with a fleet of 100 warships following in its wake. The journey to the HFY system took 6 hours, and the crew spent that time in final preparation and prayer and quiet contemplation of what was to come. Athena ran the tactical projections one final time and reported to Admiral Tanaka with the calm efficiency that defined her existence. The Concorde has assembled 200 warships at HFY Anchorage, and they believe this force is sufficient to destroy us, and their commander is High Admiral Vex Thiel, who ordered the attack on New Helsinki. Tanaka nodded slowly, and something cold and terrible moved behind her eyes. Good. She stood and walked to the forward observation deck, and she watched the swirling colors of FTL space, and she thought of her daughter Keiko, who had loved the stars so much that she had dedicated her life to studying the aliens. She hoped humanity would one day befriend Keiko had believed in peace and cooperation and the fundamental goodness of intelligent life, and she had been wrong, and her mother was about to prove just how wrong she had been. The fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the HFY system, and 200 Concorde warships turned to face them, and High Admiral Vex Thiel transmitted a message demanding their immediate surrender. Admiral Tanaka did not respond with words. She simply gave the order to fire. High Admiral Vex Thiel had lived for 600 years, and in that time, he had commanded fleets that conquered empires, and he had never once known fear in battle, because the Concorde was invincible, and all who opposed them were dust waiting to be swept away. He looked at the human fleet on his tactical display, and he felt something that might have been amusement. If his species had possessed the capacity for such emotion, 100 ships against 200, and they thought they could win. He gave the order to advance, and his fleet moved forward in perfect formation, and he prepared to add another extinct species to his long and glorious record. 3 minutes and 42 seconds later, the battle was over, and Vex Thiel finally understood what fear truly meant. The Prometheus Unbound did not fight like any ship he had ever encountered, and it did not obey the laws of warfare that he had studied for centuries, and it moved through his fleet like a blade through water. The first weapon humanity revealed was the gravity lance, and it reached out across the void and wrapped invisible fingers around a Concorde dreadnought and squeezed, and the ship crumpled like paper in a fist, and its crew died without ever understanding what had killed them. The second weapon was the quantum disruptor, and it did not destroy ships so much as it unmade them by teleporting their fusion cores into the empty space between stars, and without power, the great warships went dark and drifted helpless. The third weapon was the point defense network, and it was perhaps the most terrifying of all because it did not merely intercept incoming fire, but predicted where that fire would come from before the enemy had even given the order to shoot, and missiles vanished milliseconds after launch, and beam weapons struck nothing but empty space where human ships had been moments before. But the main gun of the Prometheus Unbound was something else entirely. It was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its effect, and it consisted of nothing more than a tungsten rod accelerated to 80% of the speed of light. The first shot struck a Concorde dreadnought and did not stop, and it punched through the hull and out the other side, and continued on to strike the ship behind it, and the ship behind that, and when the rod finally spent its momentum, it had passed through 6 vessels and left nothing but expanding clouds of debris in its wake. Vexthal watched his fleet die, and he tried to give orders, but his voice would not come, and his hands would not move, and for the first time in 6 centuries, he understood that he was not a god, and he was not invincible, and he was facing something that the Concord had never imagined could exist, a species that had prepared for them. The human ships moved through the battle with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, because Athena was conducting them like an orchestra, and she knew every Concord tactic and every Concord weakness, and she exploited them with a precision that was almost beautiful in its lethality. Vexthal's flagship took a hit that disabled its engines, and he tried to order his crew to abandon ship, but the human vessel was already alongside, and boarding pods were latching onto his hull, and he realized that they did not intend to kill him. They intended something worse. Admiral Tanaka led the boarding party personally, because this was something she needed to do herself, and her soldiers moved through the alien ship with weapons that had been designed specifically to counter Concord biology, and within minutes, they had secured the bridge. Vexthal was taller than any human, and his scales gleamed in the emergency lighting, and his 4 eyes looked down at the small woman who stood before him, and he tried to summon the contempt that had always come so easily when dealing with lesser species. But the contempt would not come because he had just watched 200 ships reduced to wreckage in less time than it took to brew a cup of tea. Admiral Tanaka did not speak immediately, and instead she gestured to one of her soldiers who brought forward a portable display and activated the recording of New Helsinki's destruction. You will watch this, and you will watch every second of it, and you will understand what you did. Vexthal wanted to look away, but something in the woman's eyes told him that looking away would be unwise, and so he watched as a world of 2.3 billion souls was reduced to ash, and he heard the screams and the prayers and the final desperate messages, and he saw the oceans boil and the cities vanish. When it was over, Admiral Tanaka stepped closer, and her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a civilization's grief. You did this because you believed we were weak, and you believed there would be no price to pay, and you believed that our lives meant nothing. She reached out and pressed a data chip into his hand. These are the names of everyone who died on New Helsinki, and there are 2.3 billion names on this chip, and you will carry it with you for the rest of your life. Vexthal stared at the small device, and his hand trembled, and he finally found his voice. What are you going to do to me? Admiral Tanaka smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I am going to let you live, because someone needs to tell your masters what happened here, and someone needs to make them understand that the galaxy has changed. She turned to leave and then paused and looked back at him. You took one world from us, and in return, we will take everything from you, but we will not kill your civilians, and we will not exterminate your species, because we are not you, and we will never be you. The boarding party withdrew, and the Prometheus Unbound pulled away from the crippled flagship, and, as Vexthal watched, the human fleet began to transmit a message on every frequency. It was a countdown starting from 12 days, and beneath the numbers were coordinates to 12 star systems, and the message was simple: 12 worlds and 12 days, and you choose which ones to evacuate. Vexthal understood immediately what they were doing, and the horror of it struck him like a physical blow. They were not simply going to destroy military targets. They were going to make the Concord choose which worlds to save and which worlds to abandon, and they were going to force the masters of the galaxy to experience the helplessness that they had inflicted on so many others. He looked at the data chip in his hand, and he thought about 2.3 billion names, and he realized that he was holding the weight of a genocide. He had committed without a second thought. His ship drifted alone among the debris of his fleet, and he began the long process of restoring enough power to limp home and deliver the message that would shake the Concorde to its foundations. The humans were coming, and they could not be stopped. And they were offering a choice that the Concorde had never offered to anyone: surrender or die. But even in death there would be no extinction, because humanity was better than that. Vexthel did not know which was worse, the fear of destruction or the shame of being shown mercy by those he had tried to exterminate. The Concorde had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never once retreated, and they had never once negotiated from a position of weakness, and they had never once faced an enemy that made them feel afraid. Now, they felt afraid, and they did not know how to respond. The High Council met in their ancient chamber on the throne world of Iskandara, and they listened to Vaxthel's report, and they watched the recordings of the Battle of Kethver Anchorage, and when the images faded, they sat in silence because there were no words for what they had witnessed. Supreme Commander Dexelar was the oldest member of the council, and he had personally overseen the extinction of the Yvreshi 3,000 years ago, and he had never regretted it for a single moment, because extinction was simply what happened to species too weak to survive. He looked at the tactical data, and he refused to believe what it showed him. This is impossible, and these primitives cannot possess this technology, and there must be some mistake. There is no mistake. The voice came from Intelligence Director Valmari, who had spent decades studying the species of the galaxy, and who had dismissed humanity as irrelevant on 17 separate occasions. They hid from us, and they prepared for us, and they waited 400 years for this moment. And we never suspected, because we could not imagine that anyone would be patient enough to do what they did. The council erupted into arguments as factions blamed each other for the disaster, and some demanded immediate retaliation, while others called for negotiation, and a few even suggested surrender, though they were quickly shouted down. But the countdown continued. On the fourth day, the human fleet struck the shipyards of Korax Prime, and they destroyed every military installation, and every weapons factory, and every warship under construction, and they did it without killing a single civilian, because their weapons were precise enough to target buildings, while leaving the apartment complex next door untouched. On the seventh day, they struck the fortress world of Dramati, and they dismantled the orbital defense platforms that had taken a century to build, and they broadcast a message to the soldiers on the surface telling them to lay down their weapons and go home to their families. On the 10th day, they struck the fleet anchorage at Ezelver, and they captured 40 warships intact because the crews had already abandoned them and fled. The Concorde subjects watched, and something that had been dead for millennia began to stir in their hearts: hope. The Marthani had been enslaved for 8,000 years, and their songs had been silenced, and their culture had been erased, and they had been forced to use their reality-shaping abilities to build monuments to their conquerors. Now they began to sing again. The Kethrani had been sterilized, and their population had dwindled to a few million survivors, who served as engineers for the Concorde because their skills were too valuable to waste. Now they began to sabotage the systems they had been forced to maintain. The Valthari had been conquered so long ago that they barely remembered what freedom meant. Now they began to remember. Across the galaxy, the subjugated species rose up in revolts that the Concorde could not suppress because their fleets were scattered and their military was in chaos, and every soldier they sent to crush a rebellion was a soldier who could not face the humans. The High Council made a decision born of desperation and fear. They activated the Stellar Hammer. It was the most terrible weapon the Concorde possessed, and it had been used only once before, when a species called the Drovani had somehow developed technology that threatened Concorde supremacy, and the Stellar Hammer had triggered a cascade reaction in their sun that turned it into a supernova and burned their entire system to ash. Now, the weapon was aimed at Sol, and if it fired, then Earth and all the human colonies in that system would cease to exist. Admiral Tanaka, received the intelligence report from a Morthani operative who had been waiting decades for a chance to strike back at the Concorde. And she understood immediately that everything had changed. The Stellar Hammer facility was located in the Kethra system, and it was defended by the last concentrated Concorde fleet, and the weapon was already charging, and they had less than 48 hours before it fired. She gathered her command staff, and she explained the situation, and she asked for their recommendations, and they all said the same thing. We have to take it. The assault on Kethros was different from every battle that had come before, because the Concorde knew they were coming, and they had prepared. And they were fighting not for conquest, but for survival. The human fleet dropped out of FTL into a wall of fire, and for the first time since the war began, they took casualties. As Concorde weapons found their marks in ships that had sailed through every previous engagement, untouched now burned and broke apart. The Prometheus Unbound led the charge, and Athena calculated that their probability of success was 63%, which was lower than any operation they had attempted, and Admiral Tanaka accepted those odds because there was no alternative. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, 47 human ships had been destroyed, and 3,000 crew members had died, and the Stellar Hammer facility was in human hands. Admiral Tanaka walked through the captured installation, and she looked at the weapon that could kill stars, and she thought about how easy it would be to turn it on the Concorde, Throne World, and end this war in a single flash of nuclear fire. Her officers waited for her order because they knew what she was thinking, and they would have followed her if she had given the command, because they had all lost friends and family, and they all burned with the desire for vengeance. She stood there for a long time, and she thought about her daughter Keiko, who had believed in peace, and she thought about the 3 billion souls of New Helsinki who had never wanted war, and she thought about what kind of species humanity would become if they used this weapon. Dismantle it. Her voice was quiet, but firm. We are not going to become them, and we are not going to prove them right about the universe, and we are going to win this war without becoming monsters. The crew obeyed, and the Stellar Hammer was taken apart, piece by piece, and scattered across the void where it could never be reassembled. The Concorde received word that their ultimate weapon had been captured and destroyed, and they also received word that 23 of their subject species had declared independence, and they understood at last that the war was over. They had not just lost a military campaign. They had lost an empire. Admiral Tanaka broadcast one final message to the galaxy, and it was not a demand for surrender, and it was not a threat of further destruction. It was an invitation to all species who have suffered under the Concorde. We offer friendship and mutual defense, and a future built on cooperation instead of conquest. The responses began arriving within hours. First the Morthani, and then the Kethrani, and then the Velthari, and then species whose names humanity had never heard, because they had been conquered so completely that their existence had been forgotten. They all said the same thing: we accept. 6 months after the fall of the Stellar Hammer, the galaxy had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had lived under Concorde rule. The empire that had dominated 4,000 systems for 12 millennia was gone, and in its place was chaos and freedom and the painful, difficult, beautiful process of species learning to govern themselves after generations of oppression. The Concorde had not been destroyed because Admiral Tanaka had kept her promise, and humanity had not committed genocide, even against those who had tried to exterminate them. Instead, the Concorde had been reduced to their original 17 systems, and they had been stripped of their weapons and their fleets and their ability to threaten anyone ever again, and they had been left alone to contemplate what they had done and what had been done to them in return. It was a mercy that many humans had argued against, and it was a mercy that the Concorde did not understand, because mercy was not something they had ever shown to others. But Admiral Tanaka had insisted because she knew that becoming the thing you fight against is the surest way to lose, even when you win. The first galactic assembly was held in orbit around Earth, and 200 species sent representatives, and many of them were seeing humans for the first time, and they did not know what to expect. The stories had spread across the galaxy in the months since the war, and they had grown with each telling, until humanity had become something almost mythical. The sleeping giants who had hidden their strength for 400 years. The warriors who had destroyed 200 ships in less than 4 minutes. The victors who had captured a star-killing weapon and chosen to destroy it rather than use it. The representatives gathered in a great hall that had been constructed specifically for this purpose, and they looked up at the stage where Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood alone, and they waited to hear what the conquerors would demand. She looked out at the assembly, and she saw faces of every shape and color. And she saw eyes that held hope and fear and curiosity, and she understood that whatever she said next would shape the future of a galaxy. "I am going to tell you a story." Her voice was calm, and it carried to every corner of the hall. 6 months ago, a species called humanity lived in 12 small systems at the edge of the galaxy, and we had hidden ourselves away because we knew that the universe was ruled by those who believed that strength exists only to dominate and that the weak deserve nothing but extinction. We watched the Concord for 400 years, and we saw what they did to species like yours, and we made a choice. That defined everything that came after. We chose to become strong, not so that we could conquer, but so that we could protect, and we built weapons not so that we could threaten, but so that no one would ever threaten us again. She paused, and the silence in the hall was absolute. Then the Concord came to our world of New Helsinki, and they killed 2.3 billion of our people because they wanted to teach us our place, and they believed there would be no consequences. There were consequences. A murmur ran through the assembly, and Tanaka waited for it to fade. We could have done what the Concord did, and we could have burned their worlds and exterminated their species and claimed their territory as our own, and no one in this room would have blamed us. But we did not do that because we are not the Concord, and we refuse to become the Concord, and we believe that the universe can be better than it has been. She stepped forward, and her voice grew stronger. "I am not here to demand tribute or territory or submission, and I am not here to replace one empire with another. I am here to offer you something that the galaxy has never had: partnership." The assembly erupted into noise as representatives turned to each other and spoke in 100 different languages, and the sound was like a wave crashing against a shore. Tanaka raised her hand, and the noise subsided. "We call it the Terran Accords, and it is built on 3 principles that will never change. First, and sovereignty is sacred, and no species will ever again be conquered or absorbed or controlled by another. Second, and the strong protect the weak, and those with power have a duty to defend those without it. Third, and no species faces extinction alone and an attack on one is an attack on all." She looked out at the faces watching her, and she saw tears on some of them, and she saw hope on others, and she knew that this moment was the true victory. Not the battles, and not the weapons, and not the destruction of the Concord's military. This, and the chance to build something better. The Morthani delegation rose first, and their speaker's voice carried the harmonic resonance that made their language sound like music. "We accept." The Kethrani rose next, and their ancient engineer priest spoke words that his species had not been permitted to speak for 8,000 years. "We accept." One by one the delegations rose, and one by one they spoke the same words, and within an hour 180 species had joined the Terran Accords, and the galaxy had changed forever. The ceremony ended, and the representatives departed to their ships, and Admiral Tanaka stood alone on the observation deck of the Prometheus Unbound and watched the lights of 100 vessels scatter toward the stars. Captain Chen approached and stood beside her, and they did not speak for a long time because there were no words for what they had accomplished. Finally, Tanaka turned away from the window, and she said something that surprised him. "I need to go home." 6 hours later, a small shuttle descended through the clouds above Europa and landed on the ice near a structure that had not existed. 6 months before, the memorial had been carved directly into the surface of the moon, and it stretched for kilometers in every direction, and it contained 3 billion names. Every person who had died on New Helsinki was listed here, and the names were arranged by family so that parents were near children and siblings were near each other, and the community that had existed in life was preserved in death. Admiral Tanaka walked alone across the ice, and she found the section she was looking for, and she knelt beside a name that was more familiar to her than her own Keiko. Tanaka, and xenobiologist and beloved daughter. She reached out and touched the letters, and they were cold beneath her fingers, and she finally allowed herself to weep. She wept for her daughter who had believed in peace and who had died for that belief. She wept for the 3 billion others who had done nothing wrong except live on a world that caught the attention of monsters. She wept for the war that had been necessary and the lives it had cost and the burden she would carry until the day she died. And when the tears were finished, she spoke to her daughter one last time. "We built something worthy of you." She stood and looked up at the stars, and she thought about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come, and she understood at last why humanity had chosen to wait and prepare instead of revealing themselves centuries ago. It had never been about winning a war. It had been about being ready to win a peace. The galaxy had spent 12,000 years learning that strength meant destruction and power meant domination, and survival meant crushing everyone weaker than yourself. Humanity would spend the next 12,000 years teaching them something different. The Prometheus Unbound remained in orbit around Europa for the rest of Admiral Tanaka's life, and when she died at the age of 91, her ashes were scattered across the memorial. Her crew began a tradition that continued for centuries afterward. Every day at dawn, a single bell tolled, and it tolled 3 billion times, and it took 11 years to complete, and when it finished, they began again. Because some things must never be forgotten, and some lessons must echo forever through the stars.